Well, it's good to see you, though. I'm glad you're here. We're going to be in Daniel 5 today. Daniel 5. Today is kind of it's kind of a setup. I don't mean set up in a bad way. Most of the time we use set up in a bad way. It's not that there aren't some things that actually happen, but there's some transitions that are occurring that are going to really set the stage for what is going to continue to be experienced as the book of Daniel unfolds. And we're going to spend a little bit of time, though, trying to identify some of the characters that are involved here, because as you read this and you're introduced to some of these names and you start thinking about this, there are very reasonably some questions that might come to mind. Beyond that, there are some tensions that arise because we have some secular history that records the names of some and the description of some of these events, where what the Bible says and what some of these secular historians said, there may be some tension. So can that be resolved in a way that makes sense, that still maintains integrity and a high regard for what it is that God has said in His Word? So anyway, we're in Daniel 5, and we'll start with verse 1. King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in their presence. There ought to be something just in that first verse that you notice, oh, that's a change. That's something different. What do you notice? Yeah, we've got a different king, because the last time we had a king, it was Nebuchadnezzar. And you remember last week, we dealt with a passage where he kind of ceased to be king for a little while. Why? Because he went crazy. He went crazy. He's out in the fields. He is eating like an animal, eating grass. His hair has grown long and white. His nails like eagle's talons. And that shouldn't have been a surprise, though, should it? Why? Because God said it was going to happen. And it was going to happen to humble him. And it took 7 years before he was finally humbled. And at that point, once he turns from his arrogant pride, God restores not only his sense, but restores him to his reign. And so he finishes out his reign as the king of Babylon. And now in verse 5, we've got King Belshazzar. The time span between the end of verse 37 and verse 1 of chapter 5 is thought to be about 30 years, which is helpful because as you're reading along, you just think, well, then next week, next month. But there's about 30 years likely that have passed between the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. So we've got a new king in town, Belshazzar. He's holding a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. Pretty big party, isn't it? But this would have been the who's who of the kingdom. So my grandfather used to say chewing gum society. You ever heard that phrase? Anyway, sorry you weren't cultured enough. You weren't part of chewing gum society. Anyway, so 1,000 of his nobles, he's drinking wine in their presence. And let me ask you this: is the best time to make decisions is when you've been drinking for a while? No, it is not. And so in verse 2, under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines could drink from them. All right, so this is an appeal back to something historically when Jerusalem has fallen. And if you are the conquering army and the conquering king over Jerusalem, what's one of the things that you'd like to do? You want to take their stuff. And where would their best stuff be found in Jerusalem? It would be in the temple. It'd be in the temple. And so there were all of these instruments of worship that were covered in gold. And so these are all very intrinsically valuable items. And so if you're the conquering king, you don't want to be like, well, I'm just going to leave that there. No, you want to take that. And so these things have been held. Why, you would hold them because they're valuable, but why else might you hold them? Yeah, to show off. You put them in the trophy case. Oh, look at it. So you walk down this hall, and so here's the stuff that we got from the Israelites. Here's the stuff we got from the Emmaites. Here's the stuff we got from the Tommyites. Here's the stuff we got, from Nikki. And so you would do that, though, because it would be a testament to your power. It'd be a way to kind of show off or to reflect on the greatness and the victories that you've experienced. But these things didn't come from the palace. They came from the temple. So these things would have been associated with God. And it's interesting, even among non-believers, you tend to experience, even from them, a sense of reverence for stuff that is deemed religious, even if you don't personally subscribe to it. Now, let me see if I can say that in a way that makes sense. I remember at the church I pastored in Charlotte, we got broken into a few times. And there were times where, because of that, you'd have to deal with the police, or then you were talking to church members about whatever had happened. And one of the statements you would hear people say is, "Man, I can't believe that somebody would do that to a church." Right? We had the catalytic converters cut off of both vans, and it was a very busy road. 2-3 times busier than what Hilltop Road is, and our vans were parked. Just 20 feet from that, and somebody came through there and cut the catalytic converters off of both church vans. And when we take it to the shop, you got a guy that has no connection with God, no connection with church at all. Say, "Man, I can't believe that you do that to a church," because what might motivate that thought? Well, that it's sacred. What else might it be? Well, church does good things. What'd you say? Even among people that may say, "Hey, I'm not on the team. I'm not with you or anything, but I want to hedge my bets, and in case you're right, I don't want God mad at me," right? And so it was certainly you've got a very pantheistic culture at this point where they're worshiping all sorts of gods, and you've got to think that there would have been this hesitancy to do something that might be an affront to some deity, whether you like them or not. Does that make sense? And so if you are taking the stuff, the elements that were used for the worship of God, and you're using them for your beer brawl, it's likely that there would have been some hesitancy that people, I don't know if I want to do that. It's one thing to put them in a trophy case. It's another thing to bring them out for a drunken party. But he does this, but why does he do it? Well, he's drunk. He's not thinking clearly. And so, verse 3, so they had brought in gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. The king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised who? They praised their gods that were made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So this is a pretty blasphemous act, isn't it? We're going to take the stuff that was reserved for the worship of God, and with that, we're going to worship the gods that we actually have made out of the same stuff. So that is going on. All right, so we've got King Belshazzar, and let me get him on the board here. Actually, I want to write with something you can see better. All right, so we had Nebuchadnezzar over here. All right, so Nebuchadnezzar is gone, right? Why do we think he's gone? Or where do we think he went on vacation? No, he's dead. He's dead. And so typically, if you're king, who's going to become? Well, typically it would be your son. But the problem is Belshazzar is actually not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Let me see. This guy is. Nabonidus, Nabonidus. I don't know if I said it wrong. He's dead. I can't be too mad. So this was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. It doesn't seem that, and we say that, or I say that based on some secular historical records, it does not seem that he is dead in chapter 5. It seems that he is actually alive. But who's described as king? All right, so his son is described as king. All right, so in verse 2, among the people that are described as being present is you have the king, his nobles, wives. So he is here, and who else? His all right, so with his wife or wives, we don't know. We're told they are there for the party, and they're drinking too. So everybody is there, everybody is drinking. All right, we're going to read later what happens before you get to verse 10, but look at verse 10. It says, because of the outcry of the king, his nobles, the queen came to the banquet hall. So now we've got a queen who comes to the banquet hall and says, may the king live forever, don't let your thoughts terrify you, blah, blah, blah. So under normal circumstances, if you have a king, who's the queen? Typically, this would be the queen, but we're told that the king's wives are where? Or wife is where? At the party, but then verse 10 says that the queen shows up. Well, what do you do with this? All right, so let me draw here for a second. You love my drawings, don't you? They're beautiful. All right, so here we have the... Well, so much for that one. All right, here we have the Mediterranean Sea, the far eastern side of the Mediterranean, all right? So, like Italy would be hanging down, well, I can't even draw a boot. There's Italy. All right, so you got the Mediterranean over here. So, it was then, it is today, that what we would know as Israel would be like along the Mediterranean coast, all right? So Jerusalem would be somewhere like in here. But think about today, what's to the right of that? Especially the further you go right, what's going on? Somebody, what do you say? Well, like in terms of countries, modern countries. Do what? Well, Jordan would be further north, but go further. You got Iran and Iraq. So Iran would be over here. Well, you've got this, because do you know, we've got another body of water that comes up over here, don't we? What do we call that one? It's not as big as, it's not drawn to scale. No, this is, the Dead Sea is going to be over here. This is the Persian Gulf. And so the Persian Gulf is going to come up. And so back in the early 90s, you saw a lot of maps that had this. And so there's a little country over here on the edge of it that became really important. You remember? Saudi Arabia is down here. But you had Kuwait. What's right next to Kuwait? Iraq, very good. And so Iraq kind of is like over here, and then you've got Iran over there. All right? Again, not drawn to scale. All right, in Genesis, we get some geography because in Genesis we're told that in the garden there were some rivers, right? There are 3 that are mentioned, but 2 of them still exist. Do you remember the 2 that still exist? Tigris and Euphrates. Do you know which one is north versus south? All right, so they run in here, and then they kind of meet, and then they dump into the Persian Gulf. All right, so do you know which one's north? No, so it's Tigris and then Euphrates. And how I remember that is this. T is for top, so Tigris on top of Euphrates. All right. At this point in history, you have the Babylonian Empire comprises all of this. Even over into, like, what's over here? Oh gosh, that was terrible. There you go. It's Africa. So what's over here? Egypt will be over here. So you've got Babylonian Empire that's even going to come all the way over to here, and it's going to come down into here. What's down here now? So if you've got Iran, Iraq kind of comes down. So there's a big country down here. They're kind of our friend, kind of. Turkey's up here. Saudi Arabia is down here. So Saudi Arabia is down here. All right. The city, Babylon, the Euphrates, went through it. Do you remember last week when we talked about, I read you some description about the city of Babylon. Do you remember something that was notable? It had walls. It had 2 sets of double walls that would 40 foot tall, 25 feet wide, and you would have guard posts every 60 feet, right? When you've got 2 sets of 2 of those, how hard is it to get into that city? Well, it's really tough. And so one of the things that you would also want to do is, if you're going to have a big city is going to need, among other things, it's going to need water. Well, how are you going to get water in if you're going to be a big city? If you're going to plant that city, where are you going to plant it? Probably with the river. If you're going to do, hey, what are you going to do with the wall stuff? What might you do? You would probably, you want that river to actually go through your city. So you'd have a section of the wall where the river goes underneath the wall, right? And that's pretty safe though too, because if you're trying to, if you put the wall here and the water comes to there, that's kind of, you're still pretty good, right? And so that's what happened, and that little tidbit's going to factor more as the story unfolds. All right, so, but you have Babylon here. Nabonidus, historically, we believe that he was in the city of Tema, and so he was the actual king, but his son was named, what do you think his son's name? It's Belshazzar. Belshazzar is in Babylon. It's believed for different religious reasons that he is in nothing worse than a sneeze is an almost sneeze. That he was in what was known as Arabia at that point, in the city of Tema. And so even though he is the technical king, the day-to-day operations are run by his son, he's essentially the de facto king. So if this guy's away, then the son's in charge. And so it kind of makes sense. Even though he is technically a prince, he's functioning like the king, and he is running and reigning from the city of Babylon, where his father is 500 miles to the south. And you think about this, back in those days, how far away is 500 miles? That is a long way. Even today, like if you had to go drive 500 miles today, that's a long ride, isn't it? And so, Yeah. So if you, from Manteo to Murphy, yes, long way. So we can kind of make sense of why the fact he's called king, because he was operating like the king. Even though he didn't have the technical position, but because the father is elsewhere, he's kind of ruling the place. So that leaves us with this whole idea of the queen. It is possible that she is one of a couple of things. She could be what is known, called the queen, but she was actually the queen mother. This could have been still one of Nebuchadnezzar's wives that had been queen then, and even though the king is dead, she was the queen. She still holds that title. That's a pretty likely, reasonable explanation as to why she's described as the queen, yet the king's wives are said to be at the party. Does that make sense? Because some people have looked at this, and even though this seems like inconsequential detail, this stuff matters because you'll have people that'll say, listen, you can't trust the Bible because we have secular historians that have said X, Y, and Z. And that's at odds with what the Bible says. And so because that's at odds with what the Bible says, that means that you cannot trust the Bible because it's not historically accurate. My point is, and the reason that we're spending some time to unpack this is to say that it is historically accurate in a very sensible way, and we can make sense of this by putting together those parts. Does that make sense? All right, so with that in mind, let's go back to unpack what's going on. All right, so the party is going on, and the longer that the party is going on with drinking, the drunker they get, the less sensible also. Verse 5 says, "At that moment the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand." All right, so last week I talked about one of the king's palaces in the city of Babylon. And you remember we looked at it. It was it 860,000 square feet? Something like that. I mean, it was just crazy. It was like, was it 250 yards by 360 yards? I mean, it was just massive, massive. 629,000 square feet. Is that what I said? I'm glad you remember because I can't. And so this massive, archaeologists have found that structure. In fact, it is believed that they have actually found what is likely the room where this occurred, which is really kind of cool. So they have found this largest of palaces in what was known as Babylon. And you got to think, if you've got a party that's holding 1,000, it's probably occurring in the biggest room in that biggest place, right? And so they have found that room. Not found, obviously, writing on a wall, but it says the finger began writing on the plaster of the wall. So if you're writing in plaster, what's the sense that you get of what's actually occurring? Is it looking like ink on paper? What do you think it might look more like? Yeah, it would be like you're kind of scratching it into it because it's likely that, I mean, like when we make plaster, well, I don't know. We don't know how hard exactly it was, but it's likely something more akin to limestone. And if hard enough you pressed, you could scribble something into it. And so what is seen is not a whole person, but just a hand scribbling something on the wall. As the king watched the hand that was writing, verse 6 says, his face turned pale. And you've heard people say, oh, man, it looked like they saw a ghost, right? I mean, if you've seen somebody that's ever been, or maybe you yourself, you've gotten caught or something and the blood just rushes from your face. It says his thoughts terrified him so that he soiled himself. My Bible has a textual note. The phrase says literally, the knots of his loins were loosened. So I don't know if that means a 1 and a 2, or a 1 or a 2, or a 1 and a 2. I don't know, but that's how petrified he is by what he sees. His knees knocked together. And so you've heard, these are all phrases we still today are. I mean, talking about your knees knocking. He is terrified by what he sees. Verse 7 says, the king shouted to bring in the mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. He said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this inscription. So it seems like this happens very quickly. This hand appears, that there is writing that is etched onto the wall. The hand disappears, but the writing is left. And he wants to know what in the world this says. Whoever has this will have the third highest position in the kingdom. Now, that makes more sense now, doesn't it? because that's the position, really, that's only the position that he has to offer, because who would number one be? Well, his father. And even though he's called king, he's operating as king in Babylon. He's number two, so the best that he can offer is number three, and he's saying, hey, I'll give you the number three slot. So verse 8 says, all the king's wise men came in, but none could read the inscription or make its interpretation known to him. So there's two things. What actually does this say, and then what does it mean? Verse 9, the king Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale, and his nobles were bewildered. So they're just kind of flummoxed. We don't know what to do. I mean, this is a problem, but we can't solve it. Verse 10, because of the outcry of the king and his nobles, the queen came to the banquet hall. And so it makes sense that she's just now showing up if she's not one of the king's wives. Perhaps she is the grandmother. But she says, may the king live forever. Don't let your thoughts terrify you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has a spirit of the holy gods in him. In the days of your predecessor, he was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. Your own predecessor, the king, did this because Daniel, the one the king named Belteshazzar, was found to have extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and intelligence, and the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. So summon him, and he'll give the interpretation. Again, why do you think she knows about Daniel? She's been around, and so it's likely that she is the mother of the king, the grandmother of the de facto king, and maybe he's young and dumb or didn't pay attention in history. He's born with literally a silver spoon in his mouth, golden spoon in his mouth. He may not know the history. And again, the difference between the end of verse 37 of chapter 4 and chapter 5, verse 1 is about 30 years. So there's been a change in leadership. Daniel might have, and with the change of leadership, Nabonidus has his own people in places of position and power. He heads off to Tema. This guy comes in, he's young and knows everything but knows nothing, and so he's getting further and further away from his awareness of Daniel, and so she shows up and says, oh, by the way. So verse 13 says that Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said or asked him, are you Daniel, one of the Judean exiles that my predecessor, the king, brought from Judah? Of course, I mean, it almost goes without saying that's exactly who he is. He says, I've heard that you have a spirit of the gods in you, and that insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom are found in you. I don't know why it is the case. Repeatedly now, we have seen dream after dream, vision after vision, unusual thing after unusual thing that needs interpretation. And who's the last person they call? Daniel. I don't understand why he is not on speed dial. But it's like, let's try everything else and then try Daniel. And in fact, on Wednesday nights, I've had in particular some folks and that say, why didn't they just ask Daniel first? Let me ask you this. When you have, because it's easy for us to say, well, they were so dumb, right? Let me ask you this. How many times in my life and in your life have you experienced some sort of quandary? You don't know what to do, and the last person you talk to is God. And who's got the answer? Well, honestly, you might get some sound counsel or some horrible advice from somebody else. But typically, what we do is we in person, or we burn up the phone, we start talking to anybody that'll listen. Oh, what do you think? What do you think? What should I do? What would you do? What would you do? What would you do? Instead of saying, Lord, here's my problem. We tend, unfortunately, we're no brighter than they are. And we, unfortunately, while we know that God has the answers, too many times he's the option of last resort when he ought to be the first choice. Anyway, such is the case with them, because people were dumb then, we're still dumb today. And so he says, verse 15, the wise men and mediums were brought before me to read this inscription, to make its interpretation known, but they couldn't do it. However, I've heard about you that you can. And if you can read this inscription and give me its interpretation, you'll be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around your neck. So you get the Mr. T starter kit and have the third highest position in the kingdom. So again, you'll get promoted. And we don't know exactly how old Daniel is. My guess is at this point, Daniel's probably 60-ish. He might be ready to apply for Medicare. Not sure, but at least he's getting close. And Daniel said, "You may keep your gifts and give your rewards to someone else." So I don't need anything, but I'll go ahead and tell you. I will read the inscription for the king and make the interpretation known. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty to your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. Because of the greatness he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages were terrified and fearful of him. So God really blessed him in the sense that he was able to grow in prominence and power, and the empire really grew, not only in size and scope, but also in actual strength, so that people knew Nebuchadnezzar's not a guy to be toyed with. He killed anyone he wanted and kept alive anyone he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted and humbled anyone he wanted. He was the Stalin, he was the Kim Jong-un, he was any dictatorial leader that has ever existed throughout the course of history, where literally he held over his subjects the power of life and death. Do I want you alive? You'll stay alive. Do I want you dead? I don't even have a good reason, but you're gone. Verse 20, but his heart was exalted and his spirit became arrogant. He was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken from him. We read about that last week. He was driven away from people. His mind was like an animal's. He lived with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like cattle, his body drenched with dew, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is ruler over human kingdoms and sets anyone he wants over them. So he lost everything until he realized that everything he had is because God is in charge. Verse 22, but you, his successor, Belshazzar, you've not humbled your heart. And it is unfortunate that we do not learn from too many times, the tragic mistakes of others. And even though this cost Nebuchadnezzar greatly, those that followed him didn't learn the lesson. And he says, even though you knew all of this, you can't plead ignorance, you knew this. Instead, you've exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels from his house were brought to you, and as you and your nobles, wives, and concubines drank wine from them, you praised the gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or understand. So you've had all of these lessons from history. Your predecessor was humbled to the point where he acted like a wild animal until he recognized that God is in charge. And then what you did is that you were so arrogant, so haughty with pride and drunk, not only with alcohol, but with your own power and influence, you decided, I'll take the stuff that was reserved for the worship of him, and we'll even drink out of it and praise gods that we have made out of the same stuff that these cups are made of. So he says, you've not glorified the God who holds your life breath in his hand and who controls the whole counsel of your life. So he sent the hand, and this writing was inscribed. In short, you've made God very angry. So verse 25, this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. So these are oh gosh, I just lost the word. It'll come to me in a second. These words were written, and so here is the interpretation. And I could be mispronouncing this, but it's okay. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Does that sound like it's going to happen? Or does it sound like it's already happened? It sounds like it's already happened. So, in short, the gig is up. Hope you enjoyed it. Willie Nelson had a song that said, turn out the lights, the party's over. And so, You don't get Willie Nelson and just quote it anywhere. All right, anyway, he's a great prophet. But that's what he's saying. It's over. It's done. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. Peres means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Historically, and again, we don't know this from this passage, but we know this historically, that so you have what it will come to be known as the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes and Persians have joined forces to make one mighty army. That they've surrounded the city of Babylon. But what? It's just kind of crickets. Because what's their problem? These walls, a stack of them, they're 40 feet tall. They're 25 feet wide. They've got guards everywhere. I mean, it is a certain death. You try to get near that, what are they going to do? They're going to shoot an arrow, hurl a rock, throw flaming tar at you. They're going to do something. And you can't do anything. We've got moats that are described as being in between these. It is an impenetrable city. But we talked about earlier that cities have to have something. Cities have to have water. And Babylon had some water going through it, specifically the Euphrates. And so it would have gone underneath the wall. Historically, what we know is that the Medes and Persians did something. If you can't get over the wall or through the wall, what might you want to do? You go under the wall. What's an easy? We've already got something that goes under the wall. We don't have to dig down. But we got that water. So if you got the water, what might you want to do? You want to divert it. And so what do the Medes and Persians do? They diverted the water into a swampy area. And you think that's a lot of work. But the people in the city, they can't stop you because they're going to stay inside those walls. And so once you drop the water level, what can happen? Even through the marsh, you just get it low enough, you can start wading through. And what did the Medes and Persians do? They started wading through. They went in the city, and verse 29 says that Belshazzar gave an order. They clothed Daniel in purple, placed a gold chain around his neck, issued a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. That very night, the king of the Chaldeans was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. So Darius the Mede, so he's the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. He becomes king that very night. Now back in verse 26, through this writing on the wall, Belshazzar hears that it's over. The gig is up. And that very night, he is killed. It's interesting. Let me give you two more names. Xenophon and Herodotus are ancient historians whose, during the time about which they wrote, are considered to be very trustworthy descriptors of the events of that time frame. They were writing history of what's going on at this point. And Xenophon says that when Babylon fell, there was a festival in progress at the time of Babylon's fall. Herodotus says that Babylon invaded at a feast time where there was drunken revelry. What does chapter 5 tell us? It was party time and everybody was drunk. And so part of what we want to do today is to have set the stage for what is getting ready to happen, but also to reinforce that the Bible is absolutely trustworthy. It's absolutely trustworthy. It's trustworthy with respect to science. It's trustworthy with respect to history. It's trustworthy with respect to your life and with your eternity. And some have sought even to use this particular passage to say, man, these are irreconcilable differences. We've got guys like this that are saying something different. In truth, what you can do is to cause them to all work together in ways that actually make sense. In fact, even with these people, what we've just done, that's really kind of the only way that this does make sense, but that is perfectly plausible and reasonable. Why? Because the Bible is absolutely trustworthy. Last thing I'd say to you is that this reinforces the fact that God really takes human pride seriously, because it very much is an affront to Him. Because when you are saying and positioning yourself as being great, and when you are celebrating your glory, we talked about this last week, that's almost like the Three Stooges trying to dot God's I's to say, I'm great. That's a personal affront to Him, and He always, always, always responds to it. So, that takes us through chapter 5. Next week, the lions finally come out. It's been a while coming, but we finally get there next week, so that's what we'll be looking at then. Any comments, brilliant additions? Frank, you got a poem that you'd like to recite? Okay. Listen, I'm glad you're here. Let me pray for us and we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you for this time today to walk through this passage. And among the things that are takeaways, I pray it has been reinforced in our minds just how trustworthy it is what you have said and you're continuing to say to us through what we know is your word. I pray that we also have reinforced in our mind that you are interested in demonstrating that you are greater than anyone and everything, and that when we put ourselves in the elevator and go to the top floor and think that we are anything, that's something that you're going to respond to, and that those that are elevated will be brought down. It was the case then, it's still going to be the truth today. So I pray that we take your glory and your greatness being demonstrated, that we make that a priority. So thank you for this time, and we say it in Christ's name. Amen.